Story number 1. 15 years ago, the district attorney in our town decided to take the day off. That morning, he called his girlfriend, told her he was skipping work, and said, "I love you." She thought it was sweet but strange. He wasn't the type to take a random day off, especially without a reason. He didn't mention plans, just told her he'd be out for a while and hung up. Later that morning, people saw him drive his black sedan into town. He parked on the main street, right in front of a diner where he usually grabbed breakfast on busy days. The car sat there all day. A waitress even noticed it was still parked by the time her evening shift started. But no one thought anything of it at first. People come and go. It's not unusual for a car to sit for a few hours. Witnesses remember seeing him walk along the sidewalk, his coat slung over one arm, stopping in front of a couple of stores. Some say he looked like he was window shopping, while others claim he seemed lost in thought, staring through the glass but not really seeing anything. He waved to the bookstore owner as he passed, but he never went inside. No one remembers him talking to anyone or making plans. That was the last time anyone saw him. When the morning came and his car was still sitting on the curb, the police got involved. At first it looked ordinary. Locked doors, no signs of a struggle. But inside the car, things got strange. His phone was lying on the passenger seat, untouched. There were no recent calls or texts after that conversation with his girlfriend, but his wallet and keys were missing, as if he had only taken what he thought he needed. The police checked security cameras from the surrounding stores, hoping for a clue, but all they caught were brief glimpses of him walking by. There was no sign of him leaving town, no footage of him getting into another vehicle. He had simply walked out of view and disappeared. Weeks later, a search team combed the nearby woods and rivers, looking for anything, a jacket, a shoe, any sign of where he could have gone. Nothing turned up. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Then months later, someone found his laptop under a bridge, hidden in the weeds at the edge of the riverbank. When the police opened the laptop, they found that the hard drive was missing. They searched the area around the bridge but couldn't find it. It was as if whoever had taken it didn't want anyone to know what was on it. For a while, people thought the trail had gone cold. But a few months after that, a woman out for a morning walk found something half buried in the mud along the riverbank. It was the missing hard drive. The cops tried to recover the data, but it was too far gone. Water had soaked through the metal, and rust had eaten away at the circuits. Whatever was on that drive was lost forever. It could have held answers, or maybe just useless files, but no one would ever know. And then came the final, chilling clue. While going through his home computer, investigators found a strange search in the browser history. How to wreck a hard drive. That's when the theory started. Some say he must have jumped from the bridge, ending it all, and tossed the hard drive to cover something up before he did it. Others believe he ran into someone he had put behind bars, someone with a grudge and a plan. But the strangest theory of all is that he planned everything. That he got tired of his life, erased whatever was on that hard drive, and walked away to start fresh somewhere far away, under a new name. Whatever the truth is, no one ever found a body. No new leads have surfaced in 15 years. His girlfriend still hopes he's out there somewhere, but even she admits it feels like holding on to a ghost. People in town still whisper about him from time to time, especially when they pass the spot where his car sat, locked and waiting. And every time I walk by that bridge, I think about the hard drive. What was so important that he, or someone else, destroyed it? Story number 2. I don't know if you'd call this a dark secret, but it's one of the craziest things that ever happened in the county where I lived from age 10 to 18. We had a soldier die under some seriously strange circumstances, and to this day, a lot of people, including his family, don't believe the official story. The way it goes is that he was supposedly high, drunk, or experiencing some kind of mental breakdown when he ended up at a nursery. Not a child care center, but the kind that sells plants. The police claimed he ransacked the place, ate some pizza he found, took a bit of money from the register, and then freaked out when he was stung by a swarm of wasps. According to their story, that's what made him panic and run out into the night. But that's where things start getting weird. On his way out, he called 911, multiple times. Each time he told the dispatcher that someone was chasing him. He was terrified, saying they were trying to kidnap him, that they wouldn't stop following him. You can hear it in his voice. This wasn't just some drunk guy rambling. He was genuinely scared for his life. Then during the final call, something changed. He told the dispatcher that everything was fine now. His tone had completely shifted, like he wasn't worried anymore. But here's the part that still gives me chills. Right before the call ended, you can hear another male voice in the background. It's faint, but it's there, clear enough to make out the words, "Tell her." Less than 15 minutes after that final call, he was hit by a car on a nearby road. The driver, a woman, immediately stopped and called 911. But while they were waiting for help to arrive, 2 more cars came speeding down the road and ran him over. He died there on the pavement. None of the other drivers stopped. When the autopsy report came out, it added even more questions. There were no traces of wasp or bee stings on his body, despite the police saying he'd been swarmed at the nursery. And then there was the scene itself. Inside the nursery, his phone and wallet were just sitting there on the counter, untouched, as if he had placed them there deliberately. But the weirdest part? No fingerprints, no footprints, no DNA anywhere in the building could be tied back to him. It was like he had never been there at all, despite the police saying he was responsible for the break-in. The official explanation didn't sit right with his family from the start. They knew he wasn't from this part of the state and had mentioned in text that he was having trouble with some of the local guys. Apparently, things had gotten heated between them in the days leading up to his death. So his family hired a private investigator to dig deeper, and that's when things got even more unsettling. The investigator reviewed the 911 calls and found something strange. Background noises in nearly all of them. You couldn't make out most of it, but in several parts you could hear multiple voices talking. And in that last call, when the soldier suddenly claimed everything was fine, you could clearly hear the male voice telling him, "Tell her." The PI's findings only fueled the family's suspicions. They believed the story the police told was a cover-up, something to protect the local guys who had been messing with him. The theory is that they ran him down after a fight and forced him to make that final call, telling the dispatcher everything was fine so it wouldn't raise any alarms. When he got a chance, he must have bolted again, running down the road hoping to get away. That's when the first car hit him. But here's where things get even darker. Of the 3 drivers who ran him over, only the first woman stopped and called for help. None of the other drivers were charged, not even a ticket. And when people started digging, they found out that one of the drivers had connections to the police department, either family ties or close friendships with some of the officers. That was when the cover-up theories really started gaining traction. The more you look into it, the harder it is to ignore how shady the whole thing is. The police never provided a satisfying explanation for why his phone and wallet were left behind in the nursery, untouched. They never explained the lack of physical evidence tying him to the scene, even though they insisted he had been there. And the fact that none of the other drivers were held accountable, despite killing a man in the road, only makes things worse. A lot of people in town think the police were involved in covering it up. Small-town departments aren't exactly known for being squeaky clean, and there have been rumors for years about officers looking the other way when their friends or family are involved in something serious. Some people even say the department has covered up worse: rapes, assaults, things that never made it into the public record. Story number 3. There's a story in our town about a wealthy man from the 1600s, some say early 1700s, who had more money than sense. He lived alone in a grand house on the edge of town, surrounded by land and barns, and everyone knew he was a little eccentric. But what made him truly infamous was the strange plan he came up with for his burial after seeing something that disturbed him late one night. It started when he saw grave robbers digging up a freshly buried body in the local cemetery. Instead of being horrified like most people would be, it made him obsess over what might happen to his own body after he died. He couldn't stand the idea of ending up like that poor soul, dug up and stolen. In his mind, there was only one way to make sure no one would ever touch his grave. He wouldn't have one. Before he eventually passed away, he ordered that his body not be buried in a cemetery, but instead be laid to rest in the roof of the barn behind his house. Yes, the roof. This wasn't just paranoia. He had planned it all down to the last detail. The coffin was to be sealed tight and the barn locked from the outside. No one was allowed inside, not family, not visitors, until he came back. You see, this man had an even stranger belief. He was convinced that death wasn't permanent, at least not for him. He believed he would only be gone for 30 years, like he was just taking a long nap. And when the time came for his resurrection, he wanted to be ready. He told his family that they had to put the only key to the barn inside his coffin. That way, when he woke up, he could unlock the door himself, but no one else could disturb his rest in the meantime. But that wasn't all. His will had another odd condition. Whoever inherited his house, land, and fortune would be required to return everything to him when he resurrected. No questions asked. If they didn't, he warned, they would be cursed for life. Amazingly, his family went along with it. Maybe they were afraid of him, or maybe they figured there was no harm in honoring the wishes of a dead man, so they followed his instructions exactly. They laid his body in the barn's roof, locked the doors, and placed the key in his coffin. His estate was passed down, but with the understanding that one day it would all belong to him again. For a while, the barn just sat there, untouched and locked. It became a kind of local curiosity. Some people thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Others believed it was cursed. Nobody really knew what to make of it, but one thing was certain. No one dared go inside. His descendants held on to the property, but they kept their distance from the barn. It was like a strange, looming reminder of the man's obsession with life after death. Years passed, then decades. Of course, he never came back. The barn, once sturdy and well-kept, began to rot. Shingles peeled off the roof, and the wood beams sagged under the weight of time. But even as it decayed, the doors stayed locked, and the key stayed buried with him, just as he had planned. At some point, curiosity got the better of someone. Maybe it was teenagers on a dare, or maybe it was just someone too curious for their own good. Whoever it was, they found a way inside. The doors were forced open, and when they climbed up to the roof, they found his coffin. When they opened it, the skeleton inside was still intact, the key resting where it had been placed all those years ago. But instead of honoring his final wishes, they took his bones and scattered them. Some say they sold them to collectors. Others believe the bones were just tossed away, buried somewhere no one would ever find them. Either way, they were gone. With the bones missing, the barn lost whatever strange mystique it once held. People stopped caring about it, and it was eventually torn down. As for the grand house where he had lived, that didn't fare much better. Time passed, and the property changed hands over and over until it was finally renovated and turned into a dentist's office. Every now and then, someone will bring it up. Hey, you know that dentist's office used to be owned by a guy who thought he'd come back from the dead, right? And just like that, the whole story comes out again, told with the same disbelief and amusement as always. It's a weird little piece of local history, and no one really knows what to make of it. Story number 4. About 10 years ago, our town went through a brutal crime wave. It wasn't just the usual uptick in petty thefts or gang fights. This was a full-blown cartel war. One cartel tried to push the other out of the area, and because we're just across the border from the US, our town was prime real estate. At first, it was chaos in the streets, shootouts, ambushes, bodies left in the open as warnings. But as time went on, the violence changed. It became quieter, more controlled. Instead of street fights, rivals started vanishing. People would be here one day and the next they were gone. The ones who were taken never came back. Those bodies didn't turn up, no funerals, nothing. The missing cartel members were being abducted, interrogated, and disposed of without a trace. Eventually, one cartel won. They took full control of the town, forcing their rivals out and reestablishing order. The streets went quiet again, but not in a good way. It was the kind of quiet where everyone knew what had happened, even if no one dared to say it out loud. What baffled the authorities wasn't just the violence, but how stealthy the whole thing had been. Cartels are usually flashy, bloody shootouts in broad daylight, making sure everyone knows who's in charge. But this time, it was different. Their operations were surgical. They struck with precision and vanished before anyone could react. The scale of it didn't add up either. Sure, a small unit or lone hitman could move like that, but an entire cartel? It was impossible. These guys had weapons, vehicles, places to sleep, kitchens to feed their people, metal shops to modify guns, and equipment to dispose of bodies. The operation had to be massive, yet the federal investigations turned up nothing. They searched everywhere: ranches, warehouses, junkyards, abandoned factories. They combed through the outskirts and followed every rumor, but there was no sign of a headquarters, no base of operations, no sign of where they kept their men or stashed their supplies. Nothing. That's when someone finally thought to look somewhere no one had considered before. A few kilometers outside of town, where the state prison sat quietly, fully operational. As it turned out, the prison wasn't just holding inmates, it was the cartel's headquarters. The entire operation had been running from behind those walls, hidden in plain sight. Everyone was in on it. The guards, the inmates, even the warden. Hell, even the governor. They had turned the prison into a fortress, fully equipped with dorms, weapons storage, workshops, and kitchens. The metal shop where they modified guns was right under the guards' noses. And when it came time to get rid of the bodies, they dissolved them in acid. They used metal drums, the kind you see in industrial settings, and dumped the remains in a nearby river. For years, people vanished into that prison and were never seen again. Rivals who had been taken off the streets ended up in those acid barrels, their identities wiped clean. There were no traces, no bodies left behind, just empty cells and rivers polluted with the ghosts of the cartel's enemies. When the authorities finally pieced it together, it was too late. The cartel had already won, and the people who made it happen, those guards, the warden, even the governor, had slipped away. The prison operation was shut down, but the damage was done. The governor, the one who helped orchestrate the entire scheme, is now a wanted man on the run with an international warrant hanging over his head. Interpol has been after him for years, but he's managed to disappear, just like those bodies in the barrels. Some people say he's hiding out somewhere in South America. Others think he's been protected by friends still loyal to the cartel. Our town has never really recovered. Sure, the streets are quieter now, but there's always a sense of unease. The prison still stands, though it's been shut down for years. People say the air around it smells wrong, like chemicals and decay, no matter how far the river flows. Story number 5. A few years back, a friend of mine decided to run for mayor in his town. It wasn't a huge place, maybe around 4,000 people, but it was the sister city to a larger town across the river with a population of about 70,000. That connection gave the mayor's position a bit more weight than usual. Whoever won the election would have a say in budgets, development projects, and cross-city policies. My friend was well-liked and seemed like a solid candidate. He thought it would be a fair fight, but things got weird fast. Not long after he announced his campaign, strange things started happening. He noticed the police had taken a sudden interest in him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, an officer driving by his house now and then. But it wasn't just once or twice. They drove by every hour like clockwork, day and night. Sometimes they'd park across the street, just sitting there, making it clear they were watching him. That wasn't the worst of it. Whenever someone visited his house, the cops would stop by shortly after to run their plates. They even pulled over those visitors later, handing out warnings for minor infractions. It happened to me 5 times in just 2 weeks. Every single time, it was something ridiculous, like not coming to a full stop at a stop sign or failing to signal long enough before a turn. No tickets, just warnings. But it was obvious that the cops were sending a message: stay away from him. The constant police presence made people nervous. Some of his supporters stopped visiting, not wanting to deal with the hassle of getting pulled over every time they came by. My friend was getting frustrated, but he kept telling himself it would blow over. At least that's what he hoped. Then the flyers showed up. They were plastered all over town, on poles and shop windows, even in people's mailboxes. They accused my friend of being corrupt, claiming that he was only running for mayor to steal money from the city. The story they used to back it up was an old scandal from more than 20 years ago, involving a loan given out after a major flood. Back then, the town was hit hard by the flood, and a lot of relief money came in. Part of that money went toward a loan to a group of local business owners who ran a strip of restaurants along the river. The loan was interest-free for 15 years, which was generous. But when the 15 years were up, things got messy. The restaurant owners claimed they had repaid the loan in full, but the town's financial records told a different story. According to the city's books, only a small portion of the loan had been repaid. And when the state got involved, they found something even stranger. The state had no record of receiving any payments from the city. Not even the partial amount that the restaurant owners said they had paid. It was a complete mess. For years, the scandal brewed quietly, with accusations of missing money, corruption, and mismanagement floating around. But no one was ever charged, and the case just faded away, until my friend announced his candidacy. Someone dug up the old story and twisted it into an attack against him. They claimed that my friend had been involved in the scheme through a distant connection. His cousin's wife's sister worked in the city's accounting department, the same department that handled the loan payments. The flyers suggested that my friend and his relative had been working together to embezzle city funds and that he was running for mayor to cover it all up. The accusations were completely baseless, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. People started questioning my friend's intentions. Conversations around town shifted from supporting his campaign to wondering if the rumors were true. The local papers picked up the story, and soon even people who knew him well began to second-guess things. Meanwhile, the police harassment continued. They didn't just stop at pulling people over. There were late-night knocks on his door, random check-ins, and constant surveillance. It was like the entire system had turned against him, working overtime to make sure he knew he wasn't welcome in the race. He held on for as long as he could, determined to see his campaign through. But the pressure was relentless. The flyers kept coming, the police didn't back off, and the media refused to let the scandal go, even though there was no real evidence. His supporters dwindled, too scared to get involved or visit him. Eventually, he had no choice but to drop out of the race. He wasn't willing to drag his family through any more stress or risk losing his reputation entirely. The day he announced he was dropping out, everything stopped. No more police visits, no more pulled-over supporters, no more flyers or accusations. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. It was clear that someone, maybe multiple people, wanted him out of the way. And once he was gone, they had no reason to keep up the pressure. The scandal disappeared just as quickly as it had started, and life in town went back to normal. And the old scandal, still unresolved. The missing money never showed up, the restaurant owners never gave a straight answer, and the city's books remain as murky as ever. But no one talks about it anymore. Just like no one talks about what happened to my friend. Story number 6, I went to a small high school in Appalachia, tucked just off the interstate. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and things didn't change much from year to year. But in the early 2000s, things started to shift when MS-13 tried to move in. Apparently, our little town was a perfect midpoint on their smuggling route for drugs, guns, and even dogs, running shipments up to NYC and DC. We didn't have much of a police presence, and there weren't any real gangs already established. On paper, we were easy pickings. But what the gang didn't realize was that this wasn't just some sleepy town they could take over without a fight. A lot of the kids at my school came from hunting families. These were the kinds of folks who grew up shooting rifles before they learned to ride bikes. For some families, hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was how they put food on the table. Deer season never really ended for them. I remember when I was in school, you could still see the outlines of the old rifle racks on the backs of some classroom walls, where they'd been removed just a few years earlier. At first, it seemed like the gang would slip in quietly. A few members started showing up at parties, trying to recruit. Some of them were selling hard drugs, stuff this town had never seen before. Meth, coke, even heroin. Before long, people started getting hurt. A couple of fights broke out at school, and there were some nasty incidents late at night that no one wanted to talk about in public. It was starting to feel like the gang was making progress. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Those kids from the old holler families. The moonshine families in the area had been running their own quiet operations for generations. They weren't a formal gang, but they had their own kind of code and everyone knew not to mess with them. A couple of the seniors at school, kids whose families had been in the area for generations, decided enough was enough. They weren't about to let MS-13 move in and take over. These kids arranged a meeting with some of the senior gang members. The plan was simple. Tell them that the town was off limits. They chose a Walmart parking lot in the middle of the night as the meeting spot. Out in a place like ours, the Walmart parking lot was the closest thing to neutral ground. When the night came, the moonshiners showed up in their old pickup trucks. They sat down with the gang leaders, ready to have a little chat. But it wasn't long before the situation escalated. As the moonshiners explained that the town was off limits, more and more pickups started rolling into the lot. Soon there were about 100 trucks roaring around, engines revving, headlights cutting through the night. Rednecks in the backs of the trucks were firing shotguns into the air and letting loose these wild, high-pitched rebel yells. The gang guys must have realized things weren't going to go their way, but it only got worse from there. In the middle of the chaos, two local kids pulled into the parking lot with police squad cars, lights flashing, sirens wailing. These weren't just any squad cars either. They belonged to two of the 4 deputies who patrolled the entire county. Turns out the kids had borrowed them from their dads, who were among the few lawmen in town. The 2 kids parked the cruisers and got out, leaning casually against the cars with the lights still flashing. The moonshiners grinned and turned to the gang leaders, saying, "Oh, don't mind the cops, they're with us." No one really knows what happened after that, but it was over almost as soon as it started. The gang guys got the message loud and clear. MS-13 never tried to set up shop in town again. What's interesting is what happened after the incident. For almost 20 years now, our town has stayed remarkably quiet. Meanwhile, the towns along the interstate, 20 miles north and 10 miles south, both have serious drug and crime problems. Things really started to go downhill in those places just a few years after the Walmart incident. But in our town, nothing. No gangs, no major drug issues, nothing. It's like the whole thing never even happened. Like the gang just decided we weren't worth the trouble. And those old holler families? They're still around. You see them driving the same beat-up pickups, hunting the same land their great-grandparents hunted, and keeping an eye on things. Story 1. Joam owned the local bar, a place where we'd all gather after work. He lived right across the street with his family, his wife, daughter, and little Maria, his 5-year-old granddaughter. Joam was a good man, always ready with a smile and a cold beer for his regulars. It all started when Joam hired a contractor to do some work on his house. Nothing unusual about that. What happened next, though? It's hard to even talk about. One day, Joam's wife needed to run to the market. Maria was napping, and it was just a quick trip. Who would have thought that decision would change everything? I wasn't there, but word spreads fast in a town like ours. Joam saw the contractor rushing out of the house, looking panicked. When Joam went to check, God, I can't imagine what he felt when he found Maria. The details aren't something I want to dwell on. Let's just say that man hurt that little girl in the worst way possible. When Joam's wife returned, he made sure Maria was taken care of. Then he did something that shocked us all. He went back to the bar, grabbed his gun, and told one of the regulars to close up because he had to kill someone. Just like that, matter of fact, like he was going to pick up groceries. For 2 weeks, Joam was gone. We later found out he'd been staking out the contractor's house waiting. When the man finally showed up, Joam, well, he did what he said he would do, right there in front of the contractor's parents. Afterward, Joam drove straight to the police station, turned himself in, confessed to everything. It was like he was in a trance, they said, just laid out every detail, from finding Maria to pulling the trigger. The trial was something else. The prosecution had everything: the murder weapon, Joam's confession, witnesses. It should have been an open and shut case of premeditated murder. But this is where our story takes a turn that still has people talking. You see, in Brazil, we have a jury of 7, and you only need a majority to convict, not unanimity like in the States. When the verdict came back, it was 7-0, not guilty. 7 people looked at all that evidence and said, no, this man doesn't deserve punishment. It divided the town. Some people say Joam did what any of us would have done, that he delivered the justice the system might have failed to provide. Others argue that we can't have people taking the law into their own hands, no matter how justified it might feel. In the end, I guess we all have to live with the choices we make. Joam's living with his. In our town, we're living with the aftermath, trying to make sense of a tragedy that defies easy explanations. Story 2. It's been 15 years since that day, but the mystery still hangs over our town like a fog that won't lift. I remember it clearly. The day our district attorney, John Redmond, simply vanished into thin air. It's the kind of story you'd expect to see on a true crime show, not something that happens in a quiet town like ours. But it did happen, and we're still trying to make sense of it. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing special about it. John called his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, told her he was taking the day off work. "I love you," he said. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from him. Later that day, security cameras caught him parking his car downtown and taking a stroll past the local shops. He looked relaxed, maybe even happy. No one who saw him that day noticed anything unusual. And then, nothing. He was gone. The next day, when John didn't show up for work or return Sarah's calls, the alarm was raised. They found his car right where he'd left it, his cell phone still inside. But his keys and wallet were missing. It was like he'd just stepped out for a moment and never came back. The investigation that followed turned up more questions than answers. Months after John's disappearance, a kayaker found his laptop under a bridge at the nearby river. The hard drive was missing. Then, in a twist that could have come straight out of a mystery novel, a local woman walking along the riverbank found the hard drive. But it was too damaged to recover any data. Here's where things get really strange. The investigators discovered that someone had searched how to wreck a hard drive on John's home computer shortly before he disappeared. Was it John himself trying to cover his tracks, or was someone else involved? Over the years, three main theories have emerged about what happened to John that day. 1. Suicide. Some believe John jumped from one of the local bridges. He'd been under a lot of stress at work, they say. Maybe it all became too much. But if that's what happened, why hasn't his body ever been found? 2. Foul play. As a district attorney, John had put away a lot of bad people. Could one of them have come back for revenge? It would explain the sudden disappearance, but not the hard drive search or why no evidence of a struggle was ever found. 3. Voluntary disappearance. This is the theory that really gets people talking. Did John plan his own disappearance? Start a new life somewhere else? It would explain the day off work, the hard drive destruction. But could he really leave everything? His job, his girlfriend, his whole life behind without a trace? Each theory has its supporters, and each has its holes. The truth is, we just don't know. And that's the hardest part. For Sarah, John's girlfriend, the not knowing has been torture. "I just want closure," she told me once, years after it happened. Whatever happened to John, I need to know. The case has haunted our local police department too. Detective Miller, who's been on the case since day one, still keeps a file on his desk. "Some cases you just can't let go," he said to me. "This is one of them." 15 years on, and we're no closer to the truth. John Redmond, our district attorney, a man who dedicated his life to justice, has become the center of a mystery that may never be solved. Sometimes late at night, I find myself thinking about that security camera footage. John, walking down the street. No idea that these were his last recorded moments. Did he know what was about to happen? Was he scared? Or was he, perhaps, finally at peace? Story 3. I've been living in this small town for over 40 years now. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, where kids play in the streets without a care in the world, and where the annual carnival is the highlight of the summer. At least that's how it used to be. But everything changed about 30 years ago, and our town has never been the same since. It was during the carnival, back in '93. The whole town was there, enjoying the rides, the food, the games. It was supposed to be a day of joy and laughter. Instead, it turned into the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt us for decades. Little Amy Johnson, just 8 years old, disappeared that day. One minute she was there, laughing with her friends, and the next, gone. At first, we all thought she just wandered off, caught up in the excitement of the carnival. But as hours turned into days, the truth began to sink in. This wasn't just a case of a kid getting lost. The police were everywhere, questioning everyone. We all joined in the search parties, combing through every inch of the town and the surrounding woods. But deep down, I think we all knew. We just didn't want to admit it. Then they found a suspect. It was Jim, the Johnsons' next-door neighbor. I remember him, always seemed like a nice enough guy. He'd been friends with Amy's dad for years. They'd have barbecues together, watch football games. Jim was even at Amy's last birthday party. The thought that he could, it was unthinkable, but he confessed. I won't go into the details. They're too horrible to repeat. Let's just say that what he did to that little girl, it was the kind of thing you read about in the papers and think, thank God that doesn't happen here. Except it did. It happened here to one of our own. The trial was quick. Jim was sentenced to 40 years. We all thought that was the end of it. We could start to heal, to move on. Amy's parents, Tom and Sarah, they tried to keep going. The whole town rallied around them. We all wanted to help, but how do you even begin to comfort someone after something like that? Then 8 years later, we got the news. Jim was being paroled. And not only that, he was moving back in with his parents, right next door to the Johnsons. Can you imagine? The man who, and he was going to be living right there, like nothing had happened. The town was in an uproar. There were protests, petitions, but the law was the law, and back then, there weren't as many restrictions on where offenders could live after release, so Jim came back. I remember seeing Tom, Amy's dad, at the grocery store that week. The look in his eyes. It was like something had broken inside him. He didn't say much, just nodded when I said hello. But I could see the pain, the anger simmering just below the surface. Jim was only back for about a week. Then one day he didn't show up for his parole check-in. His parents filed a missing persons report. But if I'm being honest, no one in town was too broken up about it. There were rumors, of course. Whispers about Tom and some of his friends taking matters into their own hands. But if you ask them about it, they just say they're sure Jim won't be coming back. And that's all they'll say. The official investigation didn't turn up much. Jim was just gone. And slowly, life in the town started to return to some kind of normal. But it's never been the same. The carnival doesn't happen anymore. Parents are more cautious about letting their kids out of sight. And every time I drive past the Johnsons' house, I can't help but think about Amy, about what happened, about how one terrible event can change a whole community forever. This town holds its secrets close. We've learned to live with the weight of what happened. Story 4. I've lived in this small Midwestern town my whole life. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much happens. At least that's what we all thought until about 10 years ago. It started with whispers. People noticed that some of the homeless folks who usually hung around the downtown area weren't showing up in their usual spots. At first, no one thought much of it. Homeless people often move around, right? But then more people started to vanish. I remember overhearing conversations at the diner where I worked. Regulars would come in, talking in hushed tones about how they hadn't seen Old Joe or Mary with the cart in weeks. There was an undercurrent of unease, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The police didn't seem too concerned at first. Missing homeless people weren't exactly a priority, I guess. But as the numbers grew, they couldn't ignore it anymore. They started asking questions, putting up flyers, the usual stuff. Then came the day everything changed. I was at work when the news broke. A customer came in, pale as a ghost, and told us they'd found something. The police had raided an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. What they found there? Well, it was the stuff of nightmares. Turns out there was this guy, I won't use his name, he doesn't deserve to be remembered, who had been kidnapping homeless people. But it wasn't for ransom or anything like that. He was eating them. I know it sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was real. It happened here, in our quiet little town. The details came out in bits and pieces. The police found a half-eaten body in that warehouse. And bones, so many bones. They said he'd been doing this for months, maybe even years. All those people who disappeared. Now we knew what had happened to them. The town was in shock. For weeks, it was all anyone could talk about. How could this happen here? How did no one notice? Some people felt guilty for not paying more attention when the homeless started disappearing. Others were just scared, wondering if they could have been next. Some folks got together and set up a shelter after everything happened. I guess they felt like they needed to do something, anything, to make up for what had happened. It helps, I think, but it doesn't erase the past. Story 5. It was my senior year of high school in a small town in West Virginia. You know the kind of place. Everyone knows everyone, and there's not much to do except cruise around and get into trouble. My girlfriend at the time, Sarah, was big into photography. She was always trying to get the perfect shot for her portfolio, hoping it would help her get into art school. One Friday night in October, Sarah convinced me and our friends Mike and Jess to go with her to this old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was supposedly haunted or whatever, but we all knew that was just small-town gossip. Still, Sarah thought it would make for some cool, spooky photos. We piled into Mike's beat-up Chevy and headed out there around midnight. The house was set back from the road, barely visible through the trees. As we pulled up, I remember feeling uneasy. The place looked like it was about to collapse, all sagging roof and broken windows. But Sarah was excited, already snapping pictures of the exterior. We made our way inside, using our phone flashlights to navigate. The floorboards creaked with every step, and there was this musty smell that made me want to gag. Sarah was in her element, though, taking shots of peeling wallpaper and rusty doorknobs. We'd been there maybe an hour when things started to get weird. It started with the temperature dropping suddenly. I'm talking like we could see our breath. In October, in West Virginia. Then came the noises, scratching sounds from the walls like something was trying to claw its way out. Mike laughed it off, said it was probably just rats. But then we heard footsteps upstairs, heavy footsteps, like boots on the wooden floor. We all froze, looking at each other. There was no way anyone else was in that house. Sarah wanted to go check it out, but I put my foot down. Something felt off, and I wasn't about to let us split up like in some bad horror movie. We decided to leave, but as we turned to go, every door in the hallway slammed shut at once. Jess screamed, and I'm not gonna lie, I nearly pissed myself. We ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut from the other side. Mike and I threw our shoulders against it again and again until it finally gave way. We tumbled out onto the porch and sprinted for the car. As we peeled out of there, I looked back at the house, and I swear I saw a figure in one of the upstairs windows. It was just for a second, but I saw it clear as day, a tall, shadowy form watching us leave. We never talked about that night again. It was like we all silently agreed to pretend it never happened. But I know what I saw, what we all experienced. And sometimes late at night, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams. A few weeks after that night, something happened that made the whole experience even more chilling. There was a bad accident after the homecoming dance. 3 kids from our school, all of them in Sarah's photography class, were driving drunk and went off the road into the river. They all died. The thing is, Sarah was supposed to be with them that night. She had plans to go to an after-party with that group, but at the last minute, she decided to stay home and edit the photos from the abandoned house instead. It's like that creepy experience saved her life. I've tried to rationalize what happened in that house. Maybe it was just our imaginations running wild, or some elaborate prank. But deep down, I know it was something more. Something I can't explain. I don't go back to my hometown much these days. Too many memories, I guess. But every time I drive past that turnoff to the old house, I get chills. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can see that shadowy figure watching from the trees. I don't know what to make of all this. Maybe writing it out will help me process it, or maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. All I know is there are things in this world that we can't explain, and sometimes it's better not to try. Story 6. It's funny how some stories stick with you, how they connect to other stories you hear later in life. When I first heard about the Towel Fight Club incident in my hometown, it brought back memories of my own brush with a similar situation in college. Both experiences taught me how quickly things can spiral out of control when young people start playing with violence. Let me start with what happened in my hometown. It was about 5 years ago and involved the popular kids at the local high school. They had this thing they called Towel Fight Club. The idea was simple. They'd wrap towels around their hands and box each other. It was supposed to be safer, they thought, less likely to leave visible bruises. At first, it was just a few football players, but it grew. More and more of the popular crowd got involved, meeting up at different houses when parents were away. One night, they were at the Johnson house. The Johnsons were big shots in our town. Mr. Johnson was our state representative. His son, Brad, was the star quarterback and one of the ringleaders of this towel fight club. From what I heard later, a fight broke out between Brad and his best friend, Tyler. They took it to the basement for one of their towel fights. But this time, something went wrong. Maybe it was alcohol. Maybe it was some hidden rivalry. But the fight got out of control. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Tyler was on the ground, not moving. He didn't make it. What happened next was almost as shocking as the death itself. Mr. Johnson came home, saw the situation, and he covered it up. No police, no ambulance, no investigation. Tyler's death was ruled an accident, a fall down the stairs at home. The truth was buried, along with Tyler. When I heard this story, it reminded me of something that happened to me in college. It wasn't as tragic, thank God, but it showed me how quickly these things can escalate. I remember getting invited to a friend's apartment one night. When I arrived, I was greeted by a bizarre scene. They had set up tiki lamps in a circle in the yard, with Linkin Park blasting from speakers. My friends were there, shirtless, wearing these ridiculous inflatable boxing gloves called soccer boppers. You know, those kid toys that were supposed to make boxing safe. At first it was funny. They were joking around, playfully swatting at each other. I remember laughing at the absurdity of it all. But then, something changed. It was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, they weren't playing anymore. They were really trying to hurt each other. I watched in horror as the guy I had a crush on got his lip busted open, his nose gushing blood. Another guy ended up with a nasty black eye. The atmosphere had changed from lighthearted fun to intense violence in the blink of an eye. I left pretty quickly after that. I couldn't believe how fast things had escalated, how these normally reasonable guys had turned into something else entirely. It was like the act of fighting, even in this supposedly safe way, had awakened something primal in them. Looking back now, I can see the connection between what I witnessed that night and what happened with the Towel Fight Club in my hometown. Both started as a way for young people to prove themselves, to feel tough without consequences. But violence has a way of escalating, of taking on a life of its own. In my college experience, it ended with some bruises and a few damaged egos. But for Tyler and the kids in my hometown, it ended in tragedy. A life lost, other lives forever changed, and a community left to grapple with a terrible secret. These stories serve as a reminder of how thin the line can be between play and violence, how quickly things can get out of hand. They're a warning about the dangers of glorifying violence, even in seemingly harmless ways. Because sometimes what starts as a game can end in ways no one ever intended or imagined. Story 1. My name's Caleb Barnes, and I've lived in Harper's Hollow my whole life. Population 600 if you count newborns and dogs. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest gossip of the year is who skipped church to go fishing. I live 2 streets over from the volunteer fire station, and until that night, I never gave much thought to how quiet things were around here. It was a Thursday when the Jenkins place burned down. Not just a small fire, gone. Every last inch of it reduced to ashes. That house had been sitting there for decades, a creaky old thing, with peeling paint and a lawn overrun with weeds. Nobody thought much of it. The Jenkins had passed years ago, and the place had just sat there, empty. Or so we all thought. The fire started around 9 p.m. I was sitting on my porch with a beer, watching the stars like I usually do, when I smelled it. Burning wood has a very distinct scent, you know, smoky, bitter, nothing like a barbecue. It didn't take long to spot the glow either. The sky turned this sickly orange, and I knew it wasn't some neighbor burning leaves. I grabbed my coat and ran toward the station. Nobody was there, of course. It's a volunteer setup and folks usually scramble in when there's a call. But there hadn't been any sirens or phones ringing, just silence. When I got closer to the house, I saw the flames licking up into the sky. It was like the whole place was screaming, if that makes sense. But here's the thing, there wasn't any noise. No crackling, no collapsing wood. Just fire. A couple of the neighbors had come out by then, but nobody dared get too close. "Where's the truck?" someone yelled. Probably Mr. Carlisle from down the street. That's when I remembered hearing about the pumper truck. A week ago, one of the volunteers, drunk off his ass, had plowed it into the side of Wilson's brick shop. Still in the shop for repairs. So we just stood there helpless, watching this house burn like it had a score to settle with the earth. And that's when I saw it. In the upstairs window through the flames, there was someone standing there. I swear on my mother's grave, it wasn't just smoke or some trick of the light. It was a figure, a shadow maybe, but it was shaped like a person. "Is someone in there?" I shouted, turning to the few people gathered. Nobody answered. They just stared, their faces pale and their mouths open like fish gasping for air. I don't know what possessed me to step closer, but I did. Something about that shadow. I couldn't leave it. I was maybe 10 feet from the porch when I saw it move. It turned its head and looked at me. My legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't stop staring. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were just black holes. No light, no reflection, just empty voids that seemed to pull everything else in. "Who's in there?" I screamed again. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. The thing in the window didn't respond. It just raised its arm and pointed at me. At me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over myself as I scrambled to get away. I swear I could feel heat radiating off the house, but not like normal fire heat. This was cold, biting, like frost on the back of your neck. The flames started to flicker, almost like they were alive, and for a second I thought I heard whispering. It wasn't loud, just this low murmur, like a dozen voices talking at once. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone, it wasn't friendly. I don't remember running, but somehow I ended up back on my porch. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even hold my beer. The house burned for hours after that. The fire department eventually showed up, but by then, there wasn't much they could do. Just ashes left. The next morning I went down there to look. I don't know why. Maybe to convince myself it wasn't real, that I hadn't seen what I saw. But when I got there, I noticed something. The ground wasn't just burned. It was blackened, like the earth itself had been scorched deep. And in the center of it all, where the house used to stand, there was a single object left untouched by the flames. A chair. An old rocking chair, to be precise. It was charred at the edges, but mostly intact, sitting there like it had been waiting for someone, or something. I don't go near that lot anymore. Nobody does. The town council tried to clear it a few weeks later, but every time someone went near it, something happened. Tools broke. Trucks wouldn't start. One guy fell and broke his leg. They eventually fenced it off and left it alone. People don't talk about it much now. Just another strange thing in a town full of secrets. But I know what I saw. Story 2. I'm not one for sharing personal stories, but what happened to me years ago still sends shivers down my spine. My name's Darren, and I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Nothing fancy, just rows of houses, a few diners, and the elementary school where I spent most of my early years. That school, God, I wish I'd never stepped foot in it. I lived with my grandma back then. My mom passed away when I was 5, and my dad left before I could remember. Grandma did her best, but she was old, tired, and wasn't always around to keep an eye on things. She trusted the school, though, especially the headmaster, Mr. Caldwell. Everyone respected him, tall, always in a suit, and with this deep voice that made you sit up straight without him even asking. But I hated him. I was 9 when it happened. By then, I'd already heard whispers about Mr. Caldwell. "Don't get sent to his office," kids would say, eyes wide. "Just don't." Nobody ever explained why, but I learned fast that the unlucky ones who got called in came out pale and quiet, like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. One day it was my turn. I'd been caught talking back to Mrs. Ellison, my math teacher. It wasn't even that bad. I just mumbled under my breath when she told me to redo a worksheet, but she was one of those teachers who didn't tolerate any disrespect. Next thing I knew, I was standing in front of Caldwell's office, heart pounding in my chest. "Come in!" his voice boomed from behind the door. I stepped inside. His office was dark, with heavy curtains blocking most of the sunlight. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic. Mr. Caldwell sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers steepled like he was some kind of villain in a movie. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with those cold, gray eyes. "You know why you're here, Darren?" he finally asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "Good. Disrespect is a dangerous thing, young man. It can lead to bigger problems down the road. Problems we don't want to see in our community." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it made my skin crawl. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just inches away from me. I remember staring at his shoes, polished black leather, so shiny I could see my own terrified face in them. "Hold out your hand," he said. I froze. "What?" "Your hand, Darren. Now!" I didn't know what else to do, so I held out my hand, palm up. He grabbed a wooden ruler from his desk. At first I thought he was going to hit me with it, but instead he ran the edge of the ruler along my palm. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to make me flinch. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my throat dry. Pain is a teacher. It reminds us of our limits. Before I could react, he pressed the ruler's edge into my skin harder, so hard it felt like it was cutting into me. I yelped and tried to pull my hand back, but his grip was like iron. "Quiet," he hissed, his calm mask slipping for just a second. "We're not done." And then it happened. The room grew cold, not just chilly, but freezing, like someone had opened a door to the Arctic. My breath came out in white puffs, and I swear I heard whispers, low, raspy voices coming from somewhere behind me. I tried to turn around, but Mr. Caldwell's grip on my hand tightened. "Don't look," he said, his voice shaking now. "Don't you dare look." But I did. The shadows in the corners of the room were moving, twisting and stretching like they were alive. They formed shapes, faces, hands, things I can't even begin to describe. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were almost a scream. "Help me!" one voice cried, clear as day. I jerked my hand free and stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Mr. Caldwell didn't move. He just stood there staring at the shadows, his face pale and sweaty. "Get out," he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, not even stopping to grab my backpack. As I ran down the hall, I heard a sound I'll never forget, a deep, guttural scream, like something out of a nightmare. It echoed through the empty school, following me all the way home. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But after that day, I refused to go back to that school. Grandma didn't understand, but she didn't force me. A few months later, Mr. Caldwell retired for health reasons. Nobody saw him again. Story 3. I grew up in a small town in Florida, about 2 hours outside of Gainesville. Everyone around here likes to think of themselves as neighborly, but when something bad happens, they're quick to lock their doors and look the other way. My family was no exception. We lived in an old house on a dead-end road, with a big backyard that led into miles of woods. It was the kind of place where you didn't worry about locking your doors. At least, we didn't until that summer. I was 16, restless and bored out of my mind. It was mid-August, and the heat made the air feel thick and heavy. I had this habit of staying up late, lying in bed with my headphones on, listening to whatever mixed CDs my older brother left behind before he went to college. That night it was around 2 a.m., and the house was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning. I remember staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling, my headphones blasting Nirvana, when I thought I heard something outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the window. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate tapping. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My room was on the 2nd floor, and the window faced the backyard. There was no tree close enough to reach it. No way someone or something could be out there. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and slid the headphones off my ears. It was quiet, dead quiet. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything out of place. After a minute, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the noise. I was about to lie back down when it happened again, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse racing, and crept over to the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled back the curtain, just a crack, enough to peek outside. Nothing. The backyard was dark, the only light coming from the moon and the faint glow of the porch light. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I stepped back from the window, debating whether to wake my parents, and then I heard it again. Not from the window this time, from inside the house. The same slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from downstairs. Every hair on my body stood on end. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, my mind racing. My parents' bedroom was on the other side of the house, and the stairs leading down were just outside my door. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the AC. Then faintly, I heard footsteps. They weren't heavy like my dad's, or quick, like my mom's. They were slow and deliberate, moving across the hardwood floor in the living room. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Call out, grab my phone, run. But I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence again, and then I heard it. A low, raspy whisper. Come down. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It didn't even sound fully human. It was like a breath caught between words, faint and chilling. I stumbled back onto my bed, grabbing my phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed 911, but before I could hit call, the footsteps started again. They were coming up the stairs. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My bedroom door didn't have a lock, so I did the only thing I could think of. I slid under the bed, clutching my phone to my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Each creak of the stairs made my skin crawl. When they reached the top, they stopped. I held my breath, praying whoever or whatever it was wouldn't come into my room. But then, the doorknob turned. The door creaked open, and I could see a sliver of light from the hallway spill onto the floor. My eyes were glued to the crack under the bed. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then I saw it, bare feet, pale and dirty, stepping into my room. They moved slowly, deliberately, like whoever it was knew I was hiding. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there frozen, but I couldn't move. The feet stopped at the edge of the bed, and then a face appeared, upside down, peering at me from the other side of the bed. It was a man, his eyes wide and unblinking, his lips pulled back into a twisted grin. "Found you," he whispered. I screamed, scrambling out from under the bed and bolting for the door. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was pounding on my parents' door, screaming at the top of my lungs. By the time my dad grabbed his gun and went to check my room, whoever it was had vanished. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. The police came, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing to explain what I'd seen or heard. But I know it wasn't a dream. I haven't slept with my window open since. Story 4, I used to live in a small border town across from the US. The kind of place where people knew each other's names, and life was simple. My name's Luis, and I still live here, though I've moved deeper into the town, away from where all the trouble happened. Back then, about 10 years ago, things weren't so simple anymore. It started when the cartel wars reached us. For the longest time, we thought we were too small to matter to them. But when you're a sleepy town sitting on the border, you're prime real estate for smuggling routes. That year, bodies started showing up, and sometimes they didn't show up at all. People would just vanish. The scariest part wasn't the violence. It was the precision. These weren't your average gangsters making noise and causing chaos. These guys were surgical. They moved in, did what they had to, and disappeared before anyone even knew they were there. Rumors spread like wildfire. People said it wasn't humanly possible for a group that big to move that quietly, not with the kind of firepower and equipment they supposedly had. I wasn't sure what to believe until it came close to home. I lived on the edge of town, near the foothills. My house was small but sturdy, built by my grandfather, and it backed up to a stretch of scrub land that eventually led into the mountains. The mountains were beautiful, but no one went out there anymore. People whispered about strange things, about how it wasn't just the cartel you had to watch out for. I didn't pay attention to most of it, though. My life was simple: work, home, and an occasional beer at Don Nico's bar. One night I was sitting on my porch. It was late, maybe midnight. The crickets were loud and the wind carried the smell of mesquite and dust. I had a beer in one hand and my old rifle leaning against the chair. Not for protection, really. I just liked having it close. It reminded me of my father. That's when I saw the headlights. At first I thought it was someone driving on the main road, but the light was coming from the foothills behind my house. There wasn't a road out there, just rough dirt and rocks. The lights moved fast, too fast for a vehicle on that terrain. Then they blinked out like someone had flipped a switch. I stood up, suddenly uneasy. It wasn't uncommon for people to pass through, but not like that. I stared out into the dark, waiting to see if the lights would come back. They didn't. I should have gone inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and stepped off the porch. The night was quiet now, too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped. The first thing I noticed was the smell, something sharp and metallic, like blood and burning oil. It wasn't strong, but it was there, carried on the wind. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the dry dirt. The light from my flashlight cut through the dark, but it felt like the shadows were thicker than usual, like they were pressing in on me. I don't know how far I went before I saw it. A black SUV parked halfway down a slope, its engine still warm. The headlights were off and the driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. I called out, my voice shaky, but there was no answer. That's when I heard it, a low humming sound coming from somewhere nearby. It wasn't an engine or machinery. It sounded almost alive. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, and that's when I saw them. Figures, 5 or 6 of them, moving through the scrub like shadows come to life. They didn't walk like normal people. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid, like they weren't touching the ground. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. One of them turned toward me, and for a moment the flashlight caught its face, or what should have been a face. There was nothing there, just smooth, dark skin that seemed to ripple like water. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. It tilted its head like it was studying me, and then it started moving toward me, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I panicked. I raised the rifle and fired, the sound shattering the silence. The figure stopped for a split second, then kept coming. I turned and ran, my legs barely keeping up with the sheer terror coursing through me. Behind me, I could hear the humming growing louder, joined by a sound like whispers. Too many voices speaking all at once. I didn't stop until I was back on my porch, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, clutching the rifle. The whispers faded, but I could feel them out there, watching. By morning, the SUV was gone, and there was no sign of the figures. The authorities kept searching for the cartel's base, but they never found it. Story 5, I'm Sam Walters, and I live in a small village in the English countryside. One of those places you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. My family owns the old Blackstone Manor, a crumbling estate on the outskirts of the village. It's been in my family for generations, and it's as much a source of pride as it is a burden. The manor sits next to the village church, which has a graveyard dating back centuries. There's always been talk of secret passages running beneath the churchyard. Most people dismiss them as old wives' tales, but my grandfather swore one led from the church to the coal cellar in our manor. He said the passage was used by Jews fleeing from the Nazis during the war. It made sense in theory. Blackstone Manor was isolated, the perfect hiding spot. But no one had ever found the passage, at least not that I knew of. Last winter, when the snow buried the village in silence, I decided to check the coal cellar for myself. It wasn't out of curiosity. It was because of the noises. For weeks, I'd heard sounds in the manor, soft shuffling, whispers, and once a distinct knock on my bedroom door at 3 in the morning. My mother said it was the house settling. My father said it was the wind, but I didn't believe them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside and the pipes groaned like they always did in the cold. But there was something else, a rhythmic thudding coming from beneath the floorboards. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but when I pressed my ear to the ground, I could hear it clearly. Someone or something was down there. The coal cellar was a nightmare in itself. The door was in the kitchen, a heavy oak slab with a rusted latch. It creaked like a dying animal when I opened it. The stairs were steep and narrow, barely wide enough for my boots. I carried a flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the blackness below. As I descended, the smell of damp and decay hit me. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air was so cold it burned my lungs. The thudding had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The cellar was larger than I remembered, with rows of coal bins along the walls. My flashlight flickered, making the shadows twist and dance. I swept the beam across the room, searching for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the cellar, one of the stone walls looked wrong. The stones didn't match the rest of the room. They were newer, less weathered. My heart pounded as I approached. The wall wasn't solid. It was a doorway, crudely bricked up. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I started pulling the bricks loose. They came away easier than they should have, as if someone wanted them to be removed. Behind the wall was a narrow tunnel, its entrance shrouded in darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, but then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from deep within the passage. "Hello?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear. No response. I stepped into the tunnel, the walls closing in around me. It was colder here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The air smelled of earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. The footsteps grew louder. They weren't coming toward me. They were moving away, deeper into the tunnel. I followed, my flashlight flickering like a dying star. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until I had to stoop to keep moving. I lost track of how far I'd gone. It felt like miles, but it couldn't have been more than a few hundred feet. Then abruptly, the tunnel ended. I found myself in a small chamber, the walls carved from rough stone. In the center of the room was a wooden crate, its lid pried open. Inside were dusty scraps of cloth and a rusted metal canister. I reached for the canister, but as my fingers brushed it, the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight had died. I froze, my breath loud in the suffocating silence. Then from somewhere behind me, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, speaking words I couldn't understand. I turned, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the flashlight. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Finally, the flashlight flickered back to life, and the beam landed on the tunnel. Something was standing there. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could describe. Its form shifted and twisted, its edges blurred like smoke. Its eyes glowed, 2 pinpoints of light in the darkness. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hands. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the walls as I scrambled for the exit. The whisper followed me, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the cellar, I was sobbing, my hands raw from clawing at the stone walls. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my heart racing. The noises stopped. I don't know what I saw in that tunnel. I don't know who or what was down there. The next morning, I went to the church and asked the vicar about the passage. He said it was real, but no one had used it in decades. I never went back to the cellar. Story 6. I grew up in a small town called Maple Hollow. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much happens, except the occasional scandal about who's cheating on who or why the mayor's son dropped out of college. That's what makes what happened last fall all the more chilling. My name's Aaron, and I live about 3 streets down from the old railway tracks that run past the high school. The tracks have been there forever, cutting the town in half like a scar. You'd think with something so old and dangerous, the city would have taken better care of it. But no one really cared until the day Shelby Morgan died. Shelby was just a kid, 16, maybe 17. She was in the grade below me, but I knew her well enough. Everyone did. She had this way about her, always smiling, always walking home with her headphones in, swaying to whatever music she was lost in. You'd see her on the tracks most days, just casually cutting across to save time, same as everyone else. Nobody thought twice about it. I sure didn't. That day was normal. Too normal, really. The sky was gray, not stormy, just dull, and the wind had a bite to it, like it knew winter was on the way. I'd stayed after school for detention. Mrs. Caldwell caught me passing notes in math class, and when I finally got out, I remember seeing Shelby ahead of me on the sidewalk. She had her usual oversized hoodie on, her backpack slung low, and those white earbuds hanging from her ears like they were part of her. I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd catch up to her, maybe walk with her a bit since we were headed the same way. But then my phone buzzed. It was just a dumb text from my buddy Nate, but I stopped to reply, and by the time I looked up, Shelby was already at the tracks. You ever have one of those moments where everything feels off, but you can't quite figure out why? That's what it was like. I saw Shelby step onto the tracks, same as she always did, but something wasn't right. The crossing lights weren't flashing, and the gates weren't down. It was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, the faintest hum in the air. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to make my stomach drop. I yelled out, "Shelby!" But she didn't turn around. She couldn't hear me over her music. And then it happened. The train came out of nowhere, like it was birthed from the fog itself. No horn, no screeching brakes, just this massive, unstoppable force barreling toward her. It was over in an instant. Shelby didn't even have time to react. 1 second she was there, and the next, she wasn't. I froze. My legs locked up, and my throat went dry. It was like my brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. Her body, it wasn't a body anymore. It was two halves, just lying there on the tracks, surrounded by this pool of red that kept spreading and spreading like it would never stop. The train didn't stop either. It just kept going, its wheels clicking against the rails like nothing had happened. Like Shelby's life didn't even matter. I wanted to run, to help, to do something, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. All I could do was stare as the reality of it hit me. Shelby was gone. Not just gone, but gone in a way that didn't feel real, like my brain couldn't accept that someone I'd just seen alive could now be that. By the time the train finally passed, a couple of other kids had gathered. One of them screamed. Another threw up. I remember this guy named Tommy, big tough football player, just dropping to his knees and crying like a little kid. It didn't matter who you were, seeing something like that messes you up. The cops showed up pretty fast, and they started asking questions, but none of us had any answers. Why didn't the crossing signals work? Why didn't the train horn blare? Why did Shelby have to die like that? The town tried to make sense of it, but no one could. The railroad company blamed a technical malfunction, said the system just glitched. But that didn't explain everything. Trains don't just appear out of nowhere. They make noise. They shake the ground. But that train, it was like a ghost, silent, fast, and deadly. For weeks after, people left flowers and candles at the tracks. The school even put up a little memorial for Shelby, but it didn't help. Not really. The image of her lying there, split in two, stayed with me. Still does. Sometimes late at night, I hear the hum of a train that isn't there. And when I close my eyes, I see her face, frozen in that last moment before everything ended. The worst part? I don't think it was just an accident. I can't explain it, but something about that day felt wrong. Like the train wasn't just a train, like it was something else, something dark. And Shelby? She wasn't the first. There are stories in Maple Hollow, old ones about the tracks. People say they're cursed, that the trains are hungry, that they take people when the town needs a sacrifice. I never believed it. Not until now. Story 7, I grew up in Havenwood, A small town where everybody knew everybody, or at least we thought we did. My name's Cal, and I've lived here all my life. I work as a clerk at the general store and live in a little trailer just off Route 9 near the woods. It's quiet out here, peaceful. Or it was until the thing with Tom Marlowe. Tom was one of those guys who always had a hustle going. Around here, he was known as the disposal man. Got junk? Call Tom. He'd show up in his beat-up Ford with the sideboards slapped on, haul your garbage off, and that'd be the end of it. No landfill fees, no permits, just a handshake and cash. Folks didn't ask too many questions, but we should have. It was a couple of months ago when I first noticed something weird. I was walking my dog, Duke, down by the old mechanic shop on Pine Hollow Road. The shop's been closed for years, just a boarded-up building with weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. Duke started acting strange, tail tucked, ears flat, whining low. Then I smelled it, this rank, sour stench that turned my stomach. I figured it was a dead animal and pulled Duke along, but he kept looking back, nervous as hell. I didn't think much of it until a few days later, when old Mrs. Henson came into the store, all worked up. She said she'd paid Tom to clear out a bunch of junk from her barn, but now she was hearing about piles of trash showing up around town. She didn't want to believe he was dumping it, but her voice wavered when she said it. "You don't think he's doing something illegal, do you?" That got me curious. After my shift, I decided to drive by a couple of spots people had been whispering about. Sure enough, behind the mechanic shop, there was a pile of garbage. Furniture, old tires, busted appliances, even some black trash bags. The smell hit me again, worse this time, and I saw flies buzzing around one of the bags. Something about the whole scene felt off. Like it wasn't just trash, you know? I should have left it alone. The next morning, I called Tom under the pretense of needing some stuff hauled away. He showed up that afternoon, grinning like always, his truck rattling as he pulled into my driveway. "What's the job, Cal?" he asked, leaning on his truck door like we were old pals. "Just some old junk out back," I said. "Mind if I ride along when you dump it?" Thinking I might have more stuff to clear later. His grin faltered, just for a second. "Ain't much to see, really. Just drop it off and go." "Still," I said, keeping my tone light, "I'm curious." Tom hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." We loaded the truck and headed out, but instead of driving to the landfill, he turned down a dirt road near the outskirts of town. My stomach started to knot. We bounced along in silence, the trees closing in on either side. Finally, he pulled up to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. "Here we are," Tom said, hopping out. I stayed close as he started unloading the truck. The place was a wreck, windows shattered, roof sagging. But it wasn't the cabin that caught my eye. It was what was behind it, a massive pile of garbage, bigger than anything I'd seen. And that smell, it was unbearable, rotting, sickly sweet. Flies swarmed everywhere. "Tom," I said, my voice shaky, "what the hell is this?" He didn't answer. He just kept working, tossing bags onto the pile like it was no big deal. But then one of the bags ripped open, spilling its contents onto the ground. And that's when I saw it. A hand, pale, bloated, sticking out of the trash. I froze. My brain couldn't make sense of it at first. "Tom," I said again, louder this time. "What is that?" He turned to me, his face blank. "You weren't supposed to see this, Cal." My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to back away slowly. "You're dumping bodies?" My voice cracked. He sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "People don't ask questions when you take their junk. They don't care where it goes. But sometimes it's more than just junk." His eyes locked on mine, cold and dead. "You get what I'm saying?" I turned and ran. I didn't care where, just away from that place, from him. I could hear him calling after me, calm as ever. "Don't bother telling anyone, Cal. Nobody'll believe you." By the time I made it back to my car, I was shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. They didn't believe me at first. Hell, I wouldn't have believed me either. But they went out there, and what they found made the news. Turns out Tom had been dumping more than trash for years. They uncovered 6 bodies in various stages of decay, buried under heaps of garbage. People who'd gone missing from nearby towns, travelers passing through, even a couple of folks from Havenwood. Tom disappeared that night. The police never caught him, and some say he skipped town. I don't walk Duke down Pine Hollow Road anymore. Story 8. I've lived in this town my whole life. You don't have to go far to hear the stories, though most people would rather not talk about them. We're just north of Boston, tucked between the shoreline and the highway, a place small enough that everyone's business feels like public knowledge, but big enough to have its share of shadows. People know us for 2 things: the bodies found over the years and the T-stop that practically reeks of despair. Junkie Central, people call it. Not exactly a point of pride. I'll spare you most of the stories. People around here say it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. But there's one I can't shake. I don't tell it often because even I'm not sure I believe it. But it happened. I swear it did. It was late fall a few years back. I just started doing nights at a warehouse out by the industrial park, pulling pallets and unloading trucks. It wasn't much, but it paid. My car had died a month earlier, so I was taking the last T train home every night, walking the 1.5 miles from the station to my place. If you know the area, you know that walk isn't for the faint of heart. It's quiet but not safe. There's always someone lurking: addicts, dealers, drunks. It's not somewhere you linger. That night was cold, the kind that creeps under your jacket and settles in your bones. I was walking fast, keeping my head down, counting the minutes until I'd be home. The wind was up, carrying this damp smell from the creek that runs alongside the tracks. It wasn't unusual, but it made me uneasy all the same. The streetlights here are old, spaced too far apart. In some stretches, you're walking in complete darkness. I was just coming up to one of those dark spots when I heard it. A splash loud enough to echo off the bridge a few yards away. I froze. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a dog had slipped into the creek. But then I heard it again, another splash, and something else. A voice. Help! It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it stopped me cold. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. Nothing, just the wind and the sound of water lapping against the banks. I told myself to keep walking, but my feet wouldn't move. Something wasn't right. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam wasn't strong, but it was enough to see the water, dark and sluggish under the bridge. At first, I didn't see anything, just the ripples where something had disturbed the surface. Then I saw it, a shape, half submerged, bobbing in the current. Jesus, I muttered. It looked like a person. I scrambled down the embankment, my heart pounding. The mud sucked at my boots, and the flashlight shook in my hand. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a man face down, his arms floating limply at his sides. His clothes were dark, but his skin, it was pale, too pale. I reached the edge of the water and stopped. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. The man was dead. I was sure of it. Then he moved. It was subtle, a twitch of the fingers, a shift of the shoulders, but it was enough to send me stumbling back. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Do you need help?" He didn't respond, but he moved again, his head turning slowly, almost mechanically, until his face was angled toward me. His eyes were open, wide and glassy, reflecting the light from my phone. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just this horrible gurgling noise. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could only watch as he started to crawl out of the water, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. He didn't stop at the edge. He kept coming, dragging himself up the bank, his wet clothes slapping against the mud. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. My phone flew out of my hand, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. "Stay back!" I shouted, scrabbling to my feet. He didn't stop. His mouth opened wider, and I swear to God I heard him whisper something. It sounded like my name. That was it. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was inside my apartment. The door locked and bolted behind me. I sat there on the floor, shaking, my mind racing. I wanted to call someone, the cops, a friend, anyone. But what would I say? The next day I checked the news. Nothing about a body in the creek, No missing persons, no reports of anything unusual. I even walked back to the spot in broad daylight, but there was no sign of him. I haven't walked that way since. I'll take the long way around, even if it adds an hour to my trip. I don't care. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't something I want to see again. People say this town is cursed, that it's got blood in the soil and ghosts in the water. I never believed it before, but now I'm not so sure. Story 9. I've lived in Redview my entire life. Born here, raised here, and God willing, I'll die here too. It's a quiet little town, the kind that looks perfect in postcards. Just one long main street with 8 pizza joints all claiming to be the best, a few bars, and a hardware store that somehow always smells like sawdust and coffee. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stand out like sore thumbs. My name's Eddie, by the way. I'm 37, divorced, and I manage the night shift at Ray's Pizza, the one with the green awning. Yeah, we're the best in Redview, just like all the others. Most nights it's slow, just a handful of locals and the occasional college kid stumbling in for a slice. That night, I swear I'll never forget. It started around 9 p.m. A storm had rolled in, and rain was coming down hard, pounding the pavement outside like it was trying to wash the whole town away. I was at the counter, wiping down a tray, when the bell above the door jingled. In walked Sheriff Hartley, dripping wet and looking like he'd seen a ghost. "Eddie," he said, shaking off his hat, "you see anything weird tonight?" "Weird how?" I asked, setting the tray down. Sheriff Hartley's not the type to get rattled easily, so seeing him like that put me on edge. "Just anything. Out of place. Strangers, maybe," he said, glancing over his shoulder like someone might have followed him in. "Not unless you count Billy Harper trying to haggle over a $2 slice earlier," I joked, but the sheriff didn't laugh. "What's going on?" He hesitated like he wasn't sure if he should tell me. Finally, he leaned in and whispered, "We pulled a barrel out of the river." "Okay." "And?" I said, not really understanding why that mattered. "There was a body in it, Eddie, sealed up tight. Looks like it had been there a while." I froze. The river runs right through town, cutting past the old mill and winding behind the pizza shops before heading out toward the woods. It's not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find something like that. "Jesus," I muttered. "Who was it?" "No idea. Couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It was bad, real bad," he said, lowering his voice even more. "But here's the thing. The barrel wasn't stuck. It was floating. Someone must have dumped it upriver." That hit me like a punch to the gut. If the barrel had floated down, it meant whoever put it there wasn't far away. "Should I lock up?" I asked, suddenly feeling exposed. The rain outside made everything seem darker, and the empty street felt eerily quiet. "Not yet," the sheriff said. "Just keep an eye out. Let me know if you see anything." He left after that, and I tried to get back to work, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept looking out the window, watching the rain hit the pavement and listening for anything unusual. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows, and every little sound made me jump. Around 10:30, I decided to take the trash out. The dumpster's in the alley behind the shop, right next to the riverbank. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but that night, every step felt like a risk. I pushed open the back door, and the smell of rain and wet earth hit me. The river was swollen, rushing fast and loud, and the sound was almost enough to drown out my nerves. Almost. I tossed the trash bag into the dumpster and turned to head back inside when I saw it. A barrel, just like the sheriff described. It was caught on some rocks, bobbing in the current like it was trying to break free. My heart stopped. It wasn't the same barrel, though. I knew because this one wasn't rusted or old. It looked new. Too new. The blue paint was still bright, and the lid was sealed tight with duct tape. I stood there staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run inside and call the sheriff, but another part couldn't look away. It was like the barrel was daring me to get closer. Before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the river. The rain was soaking through my jacket, but I didn't care. I crouched down, reached out, and managed to grab the edge of the barrel. It was heavier than I expected, but I pulled it toward me, dragging it onto the muddy bank. My hands were shaking as I ripped at the tape. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. When I finally pried the lid off, the smell hit me first. It was like rot and chemicals, so strong I almost threw up. And then I saw it. A face, pale, bloated, and staring up at me with eyes that weren't there anymore. The skin was peeling and the hair was matted, but it was unmistakable. It was a woman. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, but her features were too far gone to tell for sure. I stumbled back, falling into the mud, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. That's when I noticed something else, a noise. It wasn't the river or the rain. It was coming from the barrel. A low, wet sound, like something shifting inside. I swear to God, her mouth moved. Just a little, like she was trying to say something. But that's impossible, right? Dead people don't move. Dead people don't make sounds. I didn't stick around to find out. I ran back inside, locked the door, and called the sheriff. When he got there, the barrel was gone. Just gone, like it had never been there at all. Story 10. I live in a small town, or at least I used to. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, or at least they think they do. There's a quietness to it, a stillness, and sometimes when you're stuck in that silence long enough, you start hearing things you never wanted to know. I was working the night shift at the corner store as usual. It was a Tuesday, I remember that. Not much happens in town on a Tuesday. A few cars driving by, but nothing unusual. My co-worker Alice was supposed to be there with me, but she called in sick, so it was just me. I was used to being alone at that hour. You can imagine how slow it gets. The hours just crawl. Around 2 a.m., I stepped outside to get some air. The store is right next to a small alley that leads out to the main road. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds like it was about to rain. I could smell the wet asphalt, but there was something else in the air, something faint and wrong. It wasn't the usual musty smell of the alley. It was almost sharp. I tried to shake it off and lit a cigarette. I wasn't paying much attention to anything really, but then I heard it. It was low, almost like a gurgling sound. I looked over at the manhole in the alley. I don't know why. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It's an old town, and the manholes are just part of the background noise. But there was something strange about the noise. It wasn't just water moving under the street. It was like something heavy was stuck in the pipes, something that didn't belong. I should have walked back inside then, I know. But I was curious. I didn't think anything could be worse than the night shift at the corner store, right? So I walked over to the manhole, feeling the cold concrete under my shoes. The gurgling sound grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel it vibrating in the ground beneath my feet. I knelt down, closer to the grate. It was probably just trash, or a rat stuck in there. People throw all sorts of things in the alley, and this part of town has always been a bit off. The air around the manhole was heavier now, like something was pushing against it from underneath. And then I saw it. At first it was just a small trickle of something dark, moving through the gaps in the grate. It was like oil, thick and sticky, and it spread out onto the concrete. But then the trickle became a stream. The liquid began to flow faster, pooling into the alley like something was forcing it out from the inside. I froze. That smell, it was stronger now. Not just the asphalt or wet earth. No, this was something else. Something rotten. Something wrong. I backed up instinctively, but then I saw it. A small shape, barely visible at first, bobbing up through the cracks. It was pale, almost gray. It didn't look like it belonged in the water at all. My heart skipped a beat. It was too human. I could feel my throat tighten as it slowly came into view. It was a baby, or no, not just one, two. They were small, too small, like they'd been there for weeks. Their bodies were bloated, distorted, and twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. One of them had a dark bruise across its face, and the other, its eyes were wide open, empty, staring directly at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare, and the longer I stood there, the worse it became. The manhole shifted again, and more of them started to surface. Small, lifeless bodies, one after another, floating in the muck. Some of them were barely recognizable. No way they could have been left out here like this. The horror of it, the realization hit me so hard, I almost collapsed right then and there. But I couldn't take my eyes off them. It was like I was being drawn into it, like they were calling me somehow. That smell, that thick, putrid odor, it crawled into my lungs and burned my throat. My body was on autopilot, telling me to run, to get as far away from that manhole as I could, but I couldn't make myself move. And then I heard the voice, soft, almost a whisper, but clear as day. Help! Us! I whipped my head around, looking for anyone, anything, but the alley was empty. I was alone. I glanced back at the manhole, but there was no mistaking it now. Those eyes, wide and lifeless, were still staring up at me, even though they should have been long gone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as the bodies began to slowly sink back into the manhole, one by one, as if the ground was swallowing them whole. My legs wouldn't move. My hands were shaking so badly that the cigarette dropped from my fingers. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The quiet town, the one I'd lived in my whole life, had never felt so suffocating. I wanted to run, but my feet were stuck, cemented to the ground. I wanted to turn around, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I don't know how long I stood there. I don't know what made me finally break free, but at some point I turned and bolted back into the store, locking the door behind me. I called the cops, but when they came, they said there was nothing there, nothing out of the ordinary. The manhole was empty. No bodies, no blood, no signs of anything that had happened. But I know what I saw. I saw those faces, those lifeless eyes staring at me, begging me for something I couldn't give. I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget what came out of that manhole. And I'll never be able to shake the feeling that something dark and wrong is still waiting down there. I don't work the night shift anymore. Story 1, I don't know if it's considered a dark secret, but in the county I lived in from ages 10, 18, we had a soldier die under some extremely questionable circumstances. They said he was high/drunk/experiencing mental distress and raided a nursery, the plant kind. They claimed he was attacked by wasps and ran. He called 911 several times and claimed that someone was chasing him and was trying to kidnap him. In the last 911 call, he said everything was fine suddenly. Just 15 minutes later, he was struck by a woman who stopped and called 911. He was ran over 2 more times and died. The autopsy showed no signs of bee or wasp stings. The connection to the nursery is due to the fact that it was just up the road from where he died. The place was ransacked, pizza eaten, money taken. But his wallet and phone were sitting on the counter, undisturbed. However, the family was not okay with that explanation, especially because he had previously texted that there were some problems with the local boys, since the soldier wasn't from this part of the state. So the family had a private investigator look into it. They analyzed the 911 recordings and found several instances of other people talking in the background, though most of it couldn't be made out, except one. In the 911 call where he told the operator that everything was fine, a male voice could be heard saying, "Tell her." In the nursery, there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no footprints that lead back to the soldier, even though his phone and wallet were there in the building. A lot of people, his family included, think he was killed by some of the local guys there after they got into a fight about something. They chased him down and caught him. He was able to run again after the final 911 call and was hit by a driver while trying to get help. And the police in the county covered the entire thing up because the boys involved were connected to the department somehow. Of the 3 drivers, none were charged for hitting/running over him. I think only the first driver stopped, but it was discovered that one of the other drivers was connected to the department either through family or friendship. It's a crazy story, but you can look it up. Just search Austin McGaw. I wouldn't be too surprised since there is a lot of shady stuff happening in small-town police departments, including covering up rapes that officers commit. I really hope his family gets him justice. Story 2, a freshman with Asperger's was being abused by his family at home. He was a problem child and got in trouble on purpose, but no one went too hard on him because of his home life. He was a well-loved kid at school and in the community. One day just before holiday break in December, he was really sick, but his mom sent him to school anyway. Locked him out of the house. He decided to try and get into one of the empty houses down the street through the chimney. Now this kid was the size of a second grader, but he was too big to fit through since chimneys taper down thinner. Mom never answered her phone when the school reported him missing. Went a whole day without reporting her kid missing. No one knew what happened to him. It was about a month and a half before we knew what happened to him. We all thought he ran away, was alive somewhere, maybe went to his sister's house. Nope. Dead in a chimney. The schools organized an entire week of counseling and such. They wore pink for a day and hangled about little pink ribbons on pins for him, since his favorite color was pink. Everyone was hit really hard by it. That's how our small town started 2020. It hasn't gotten any better, as you can see. So weird that it's almost been 2 years now. Story 3. No one thought to look there. About a decade ago, there was a crime spike here. It was really bad because one cartel tried to displace the other, and because we're a sleepy town across the border from the US, we're prime cartel real estate. However, when they weren't tearing each other up in the streets, they would abduct, interrogate, kill, and dispose of the bodies of their rivals, until eventually one cartel managed to keep the town. One thing that baffled the authorities was their stealth. They came out of nowhere, struck their target, and vanished into the shadows. That may be possible for a small unit or even a lone agent, but that's unheard of in a cartel. Federal investigations were made, and no one was able to find the cartel's HQ. It had to be big because they had weapons, vehicles, metal shops, dorms, kitchens, and the corpse disposal equipment. They looked everywhere. Nearby ranches, warehouses, junkyards, nothing. Until they looked where no one thought to look. A few kilometers outside of here is a fully operational state prison that they were using as their HQ. Everyone was in on it, from the inmates to the guards to the warden to the governor. People were killed there, dissolved in acid, and the drums were dumped in a nearby river. Since then, the prison operation has been shut down, and the former governor is a wanted man by the Interpol. Story 4, small high school in Appalachia just off the interstate. In the early 2000s, MS-13 started moving in, recruiting, since apparently we were a great midpoint on the drug smuggling route to NYC and DC. Few cops, not very sophisticated, no local gangs. But this was a place where half the pickups had rifle racks, and a lot of the poor kids hunted year-round as a key part of how the family ate. When I went there, you could actually see where the old rifle racks had been removed from the back of the school classrooms a few years earlier. A few gangers move in, start recruiting, selling hard drugs. Some nasty incidents happen. A few seniors from moonshine families say they want to join up and set up a meeting in a Walmart parking lot middle of the night with the gang senior leaders. They show up, start explaining to the gang guys that the town is off limits. As they're talking, about 100 pickups show up and start roaring around the lot, with rednecks in the backs, rebel yelling, and firing shotguns into the air. To top it off, 2 kids whose dads were 2 of the 4 local deputies borrowed their dad's squad cars, pulled in with the lights on, and just sat there. The moonshiners talking to the gangers say, "Oh, don't mind the cops, they're with us." Now I wasn't there, my family wasn't from around here since my parents has moved in only about 15 years earlier. But the story spread, and everyone knew who the Holler families were. And knowing a few of those kids, I believe that, while it may have been exaggerated, something did happen. And almost 20 years later, the towns 20 miles north and 10 miles south along the interstate both have major drug and crime issues that started a couple years after the alleged incident, while my old town has basically no issues. Those old families are still there. Story 5. Another short edit, okay, actually not short. One Friday night, Saturday morning. In late fall, I was leaving a football after party. I see a teammate walking along the road. We're miles from anywhere and there's snow on the ground, but he says he's walking home. Casually says he'll just rack out in the woods if he gets tired. I insist on giving him a ride. 20 minutes of driving through twisty, steep, barely one-lane mountain roads later, I have to stop for a tree across the road. I've been stopped maybe 20 seconds when an incredibly old guy in a winter camo ghillie suit just melts into view and taps the muzzle of an AK on my window. I have this vivid memory of the moonlight glinting off an old-style starlight scope and noticing a huge knife strapped across his chest. He doesn't say anything, just stares right through my head with his 1,000-yard stare. Alan leans by me, moving slowly, puts his hands in plain sight on the window, and loudly says, "Soak, Uncle Eddie, it's me." I'm frozen with shock. I glance at my teammate, who gives this big Cheshire cat grin and settles back in his seat. I glance back at the window and the old guy is gone. Totally gone. Bright moonlight on white snow. But I look away for 2 seconds and I can't find where Uncle Eddie went. My teammate directs me to back up 30 yards, then shows me this little cutoff that was basically invisible diving by. It loops around the fallen tree and back to the road. I stalled my old Bronco twice, trying to start but managed to drive another mile or so until he directs me to stop at a little path and let him out. I don't really remember the conversation. I'm not actually sure I said anything, but I remember a few snippets of what he said. "That's my great Uncle Eddie. Don't mind him. He came back from the war a little funny, like a lot of them. He knows you now. You'll be fine." Pause. "But maybe don't come up here by yourself. His memory ain't much anymore. He should let you out, though." No, chuckle. "You do slash not slash want to try taking the cutoff without checking in first." Just no. I drove back still on autopilot. I stopped at the tree. The old guy appeared. I showed my hands and declared, "It's okay, Uncle Eddie. It's me." He disappeared. I backed up and took the cutoff again. I was 17 and totally shaken up. It took me until 3 a.m. to find my way out of the holler. When I finally found a real road with a route sign and a dotted line down the middle, I stopped and just sat there shaking violently for a while. I get home at nearly 5 a.m. and my dad is waiting up. After one look at my face, he switched from mad to concerned. I slowly get the story out and fall asleep. When I wake up, he quietly tells me he's made some calls and, unnecessarily, suggests that maybe I shouldn't go up that holler again. That was the night I learned that mountain folk have their own gated communities and their own methods for tolerating, employing mentally ill relations. It's also why I mostly believe the first story legend I shared. My teammate's elder brother had supposedly been one of the lead negotiators with the gang.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.